So having you here is an absolute pleasure, man, an absolute honor. And thank you so much for your time. So without any further ado, let me just ask you about GLPs and energy, specifically because you co-wrote a fantastic book called Eat for Energy. People who are using GLP-1s, are they actually feeling better, or are they losing energy while running on empty?
Well, I think that there's like transient changes and then there's long-term changes. So transiently, when you're dieting, you're going to be more fatigued because that's just a natural byproduct of being in a chronic energy deficit. Your brain is going to make you more tired, make physical activity seem less enjoyable so that it can attempt to conserve energy because it doesn't know that you're dieting, and then you're going to stop and eat normally again. It just thinks, goodness, like there's not enough food. Let's see if we can hold on for as long as possible. And so it doesn't matter if you take a GLP-1 or if you just strong arm it through diet and exercise or whatever. When you diet, you're going to be more tired. In the long term, though, energy levels should increase if you're coming from like a place of obesity, because the two major causes of fatigue from like a chronic disease standpoint are mitochondrial dysfunction and then inflammation. And so when you lose body fat through these GLP medications, you are fundamentally improving mitochondrial function because your body essentially becomes less toxic by getting your fat beneath your personal fat threshold and helping to remove fat that's stored inappropriately in your skeletal muscle, liver, pancreas, all of that. And that also lowers inflammation. And inflammation acts in the brain. It crosses inflammatory signaling molecules cross your blood-brain barrier, and they bind to specific cytokine receptors in the brain that invoke what's called sickness behavior. And so this is things like fatigue, apathy, anorexia. And from an evolutionary perspective, that was very advantageous because the only times we experienced inflammation was when we were either sick or injured. And so having that signal where, hey, you need to slow down, rest, recover was very good in those circumstances. The issue today is that a ton of people are walking around chronically inflamed. And so they have this low level inflammation that's kind of creating this low level sickness behavior around the clock. And that's draining their energy.
Would this explain, and I apologize for my ignorance here, but would this explain this phenomenon where, and this comes from a person who lost approximately 200 pounds of body weight, whenever I work with clients who are at that top tier of being overweight, obese, someone also morbidly obese, when they start losing weight, Alex, and they lose, let's say, first 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds, they get this surge of energy that's not really congruent with the amount of calories that they are consuming. We are talking about like crash diets. We're talking about someone who is like 250, 300 pounds overweight, and they start with very rigorous diets. Their intake is, 1,500 calories, something like that, right? Hypothetically, we're talking about here, even though in practice I've seen it quite a few times, including my own case. And then when they start losing weight, despite of that very incredibly low intake or a massive deficits that they made, they feel this enthusiasm, they feel this adrenaline. It's almost like this unbelievable surge of energy that they get that doesn't necessarily translate into more movement, but certainly they do get that sensation of energy. Is there something to that?
I think there's probably a couple things going on. So the first is that, especially in somebody who's overweight or obese, you're going to have a fundamental metabolic switch happen when you start dieting. So if you're obese, then essentially by definition, you've been in a state of chronic, like mTOR anabolic over signaling, because your body has just constantly built, and stored more fat without getting a break. And that's how you became obese. And so when you start dieting, what you're going to do is you're going to flip that switch to be more AMPK based, because suddenly your cells are going to need energy. And so the signaling is going to move from energy storage to energy release. And so you're going to get a greater breakdown of glycogen, glucose, fatty acids become more available for use as a fuel. And that's going to give you this sense of energy, because you're no longer in storage mode. And then on top of that, there's the whole stress hormone response. So especially very early in dieting, you can get kind of that surge of energy. And that's just because your body enters into a stress state. You release adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, because all of these molecules work to get your body to release the energy that you need because you're no longer eating it. And then the third thing I would say, especially over time, is imagine that you were spending your life wearing a weighted vest. Everything you did, you had to wear a weighted vest, but now suddenly you're taking weights off that vest one by one. Even if you have, a down regulation, like your brain is like, we need to conserve energy. If that's happening alongside removing this weight vest, you're going to feel lighter. You're going to feel better because you're no longer lugging around as much weight. And that's just going to make navigating the physical world easier. And people perceive that as, I have more energy. And it's like, not really. It's just now you're not walking, with a 20 or a 40 pound weight vest on. And that makes it easier, like by definition.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So that's literally like me. Whenever I lose 5 pounds, I can do more pull-ups, and I feel lighter, right? So like, I get this pep in my step, essentially.
Yeah.
Loving the weighted vest analogy as well. But conversely, what's also happening is that a lot of people, well, we are talking specifically about, we're not talking specifically about GLP-1 use, right? We're talking about general transformations. A lot of people do feel terrible. They feel like they're absolutely lacking energy, and they feel exhausted. They feel this constant lethargy. Their sleep is disrupted after transformations. However, what I'm curious about, like, we do have this period of, perceived energy, and then all of a sudden you have this crash in energy, and that's what I've seen with a lot of my clients, especially those who are fighting with obesity.
Yeah, I mean, it's super individual. Some people kind of ride a roller coaster going up and down on energy levels. Other people, it's more consistent changes in one direction or the other. And I don't have a good explanation for why that is. I think it just comes down to, where's everyone starting from? What is it they're doing specifically in their daily lives? What are they eating? How much are they eating? Because all the factors that we've talked about up to this point kind of aggregate together, and it produces some type of net effect. And that effect can ultimately change from like week to week or month to month, just based on how the inputs are changing. When it comes to energy levels with dieting, a like generalization that I would make would be losing body fat's going to improve your energy levels over the long term. During the diet itself, you might feel more energetic. You might feel a little more lethargic. It might shift, but the long-term goal is going to be improvement.
Yeah. And in regards to goals and the outcomes, so what I've seen in the fitness industry, especially from bigger social media influencers, there's a lot of, I believe, fear-mongering and exaggerations of side effects, in particular muscle loss. Now, you and I, off camera, we touched upon this with our very first attempt of recording this, if you remember. Can you please elaborate, like, how accurate are those studies and those claims that people who are using GLP-1s can lose up to like 25-30% of muscle mass? Is there anything to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what shows up in the clinical trials, but it's no different than studies of just getting people to diet on low calorie diets. So it's not an effect specific to GLP-1s. It's an effect specific to not eating enough protein and not doing any resistance training. There hasn't been a single GLP trial or any, tirzepatide or retatrutide, like none of them have had a trial where the participants are put on a high protein diet or told to engage in resistance training. And
Yes.
those two things alone can minimize, if not completely prevent, muscle loss. There's two studies that come to mind. One of them involved 1,400 obese people, and they were trying to test the efficacy of a protein sparing modified fast. So all they did was have these people eat about 1.5 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of their current body weight. And then they had them diet on just that with minimal added fat or carbohydrate. So they were eating like, 6 to 800 calories every day, but it was all coming from protein. And they only lost 16% of their total weight loss from lean tissue compared to, 20 to 30% from rapid dieting without high protein intake, and 50% if you just do complete fasting without eating anything at all. And then there was another study where they took obese people and they put them on two different diets. The diets were identical except for protein content. One of them was 1.2 grams per kilogram. The other was 2.4 grams per kilogram. And then they put them on a 40% energy deficit for 8 weeks and had them all do resistance training. And what they found is that the lower protein group with the resistance training didn't lose any muscle. They didn't gain any, but they didn't lose muscle, and they just lost pure body fat. Then the high protein group, despite eating the same amount of calories, the high protein group actually gained lean body mass despite losing, 15 pounds of body fat, which was marginally more than the lower protein group lost. So true body recomposition, so with GLP and these medications, we really just need a study that is like, okay, everyone takes these drugs. One group doesn't get any other advice. One group is advised and helped to eat a high protein diet. Another group does resistance training. And then maybe like a fourth group does high protein plus resistance training. And that would fundamentally tell us what the effects are with those two variables incorporated.
Yeah, so my takeaway from what I just learned from you is that if we, and I mean, I've been practicing this with my clients, just kind of makes sense, because the way that I see GLP-1 interventions is the same way that I would see something like protein sparing modified fast that I've personally practiced for a couple of months and got, tremendous results. However, like my energy absolutely crashed after that. But my main takeaway here is that if people are on GLP-1s, there are two main points in if they want to minimize muscle breakdown or if they want to completely halt muscle loss, which is resistance training and adequate protein intake. I would ask you, there are two caveats, at least for me, so please correct me if I'm wrong. However, I think the intensity of resistance training and the volume, I think they also have to be adequate and they have to be properly applied to the training program. And I also think that maybe I'm wrong here, but the actual dosage of GLP-1 can determine whether someone loses more or less lean muscle tissue. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, first of all, with training, like you want to engage in structured resistance training with adequate intensity and volume that, involves progressive overload. Like that's, fundamental resistance training, the basics. With GLPs, I don't know if a lower dose affects muscle loss independent of it probably affects how much someone's eating. So, if you microdose a GLP or use a low dose, you're not going to have the same level of appetite suppression that you would get if you used a higher dose. And if you're not paying attention to what you're eating and you're just going based off appetite, then the lower your appetite, the lower your energy intake, the more rapid you lose weight, the lower your protein intake probably. And so you're going to see greater, losses in lean body mass, but I don't think that's an effect of the GLP dose. It's just an effect of how rapidly are you dieting.
That makes sense. In terms of appetite suppression, as you just mentioned, can you explain how does the appetite suppression actually work? Like, what are the mechanisms behind it?
So I'm not an expert on like GLP pharmacology, but my understanding of it is that these drugs bind to receptors in the brain, in the hypothalamus, and they essentially activate satiety neurons. So I think of these as like the same neurons that get activated by crap, I'm totally blanking, leptin. And so leptin is a potent satiety hormone that's released by fat tissue. These drugs essentially activate those same neural pathways, which is super advantageous in people who are obese and who are resistant to the effects of leptin because of their obesity, so that they still get that centrally mediated hunger suppression. And another side effect of this is that it dampens the reward pathways, the limbic system in the brain. So in many ways, obesity can be seen as a type of food addiction. It is basically, the culmination of maladaptive habits that revolve around food. So some people have maladaptive habits, with drinking, some with other types of drugs, gambling, shopping. These are all compulsive behaviors. And eating is no different. And the end result of that is obesity. And so by dampening the reward pathway, you're essentially making food less enjoyable and less rewarding for these people and helping break that cycle. And this is why we're also seeing a lot of good emerging research using GLPs in addiction. Like if you give a semaglutide to a group of people with alcohol use disorder, they're like the very next day, their alcohol intake, it drops by half without doing anything else. And that's simply because they don't get as much enjoyment from drinking. It's the same with eating.
Yeah, I mean, your wife, Brianna Thoreau, two of us had an amazing conversation and we talked about in depth about the addiction context and the GLP-1 use. And Brianna mentioned exactly what you mentioned in the context of alcoholism. But also one thing that she mentioned, which was incredibly interesting to me, is because they GLP-1s dampen the reward center, what happens is that even people who have hypersexuality or issues with porn addiction, stuff like that, could theoretically reduce their addiction or at least reduce the number of addictive episodes or triggers. And I think that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of things that I think in the following few years that we're going to learn about GLP-1s. I think based on what you're teaching me and what I learned from Brianna as well, is that they might start being more applicable in not just weight loss, but potentially maybe even in psychotherapy. I don't know, do you see it that way? But Brianna agreed. So wanted to ask you about, you mentioned, proper mitochondrial nourishment or function. So when we're talking about proper nourishment, proper nutrient intake, nutrient variety, and we talk about appetite suppression at the same time. What I've seen so far with clients who are using GLP-1s, and I haven't worked, I have to admit, I haven't worked with hundreds of people, but I am currently working with several people who are using GLP-1s, mainly Ozempic. What happens is that we kind of now have a different issue. So far, it was just food noise and this psychological mental barriers to overcome hurdles and get to the desired weight. Right now, getting to the desired weight is a much more straightforward and easier path to that goal. However, proper nourishment and proper nutrient variety is becoming a big issue for some of my clients. So they will most of the time resort to what feels most familiar and also what's most palatable. So again, what I'm seeing is I see this trend where not necessarily nutrition doesn't necessarily improve in the context of nutrient quality and nutrient density, but a lot of times it reinforces the intake of highly palatable, highly caloric foods. But it comes from a different place. It almost comes from a place of necessity, if you know what I mean, because, they can have like 400 calories throughout the day of like total intake, and then comes the evening, they just feel either terrified that they're going to drastically lose a lot of weight and potentially lose a lot of muscles. A lot of times eating stuff like burgers and pizzas and ice cream get them to at least some kind of adequate calorie intake. This is certainly not just me, but do you think that this might become a bigger problem?
I don't know. I don't work with people, and so I can't say like through personal experience if I've witnessed any of this stuff. I think it's a big issue fundamentally is that people use these drugs to try and circumvent needing to engage in the behavior change that would ultimately lead to the same. And so it would not, it's not surprising to me at all that people get on these drugs, and instead of changing what they eat, they just start eating less of all the crappy foods they were already eating. And like that's just totally normal and expected, because like fundamentally you need to have a desire to change your habits, to change your eating behaviors. And most of these people don't have that desire, which is why they've stayed obese for so long. And now these drugs have come along, and they just use the drug. They ride the appetite suppression without, again, needing to do any of the work. Now, I don't think that's bad. Like, it's not a moral failing. I think these drugs are excellent for a variety of reasons, because someone staying, obese is not only hurting themselves, but, they're essentially hurting society through things like increased healthcare costs and reduced productivity. So I'm all for, eradicating every obese person, or, what I mean, like eradicating obesity, like no matter how we achieve it. But we need to be forthcoming with the reality that these people don't desire to change their behaviors. And so they're probably going to need to be on these drugs for the rest of their life, because they don't want to put in the work to maintain these changes without the drugs. And that's their choice,
Yeah, and earlier we touched upon this idea of fitness professionals and coaches with, especially those with big followings, just fear-mongering people by over-exaggerating side effects. But I think, speaking of coaching landscape, and this pertains to my career as well, I'm a big proponent of GLP-1 use as a tool, not as the only resort, certainly not in the context of abuse, because I think if we over-rely on that tool, or that tool is the only way that we manage weight, I think being on it indefinitely could potentially be harmful. I think what GLP-1s are in the situation where they are a fantastic tool, I think they give people an opportunity. They present almost like an empty canvas where we can now peacefully, without this food noise and we constant thinking about food, we can now try to build new habits so that we don't have to indefinitely be on these drugs. However, as you mentioned, we see a lot of people who just don't give a fuck and they just don't care about habits because they think, I had a conversation with a client, former client, which is interesting. He stepped away from coaching and he literally said this. I wasn't trying to convince him, but here's what he said. He said something in the lines of, well, if I lose 60 pounds or something like that, and then I regain 30 pounds without Ozempic, I'm just going to take Ozempic again and get back to where I was. So you have that mentality as well. For me, I think I have an extensive history with substance abuse. And I will say that for me, that reminds me a lot of my way of thinking. And I think that can be harmful. But for me, the only thing that I can do is just educate my clients and people that we just talked about, people who just, don't care. Alex, I just think that from a coaching perspective, I think that's great, because these people wouldn't, be particularly great clients as well. And I'm not shitting on people. Some people are just not, they're just not for coaching and they can't be coached, right? So I think for us, when it comes to coaching landscape and our careers, I think we're going to be better than ever because on one hand, we will improve quality of our clients, which means client satisfaction is going up. And I think at the same time, GLP-1s can single-handedly filter a lot of bad fucking coaches because a lot of people are relying on everything but the human touch. And for us who listen and for us who want to guide people through and educate people and do our best to actually educate them, I think we're always going to be fine. Your book is called Eat for Energy. And in the last couple of years, like we're talking about millions of people losing weight on GLP-1s. I know you're very data-driven and evidence-based. I wanted to ask you, based on everything you read and everything you know, do you have any concerns about how all of this with GLP-1s is actually playing out?
I actually think GLP-1s are like the next level of medication. They have a ridiculously good safety profile. They're incredibly effective, even at doses well below what has been studied in clinical trials. And they have such broad application potential that we're just now like beginning to really discover. And frankly, I think the net effect on society from these drugs is going to be hugely beneficial. Like there's really no way to conceptualize, just hypothetically speaking, the impact on society if 33% of the population was no longer obese, or if, 70% of the population was no longer overweight. Like it's mind boggling to think about. And then on top of that, if these drugs end up helping people overcome their addictive behaviors, again, whether that's alcohol, substances, gambling, pornography, whatever, that's huge. And then we're also starting to see a signal with things like autoimmune diseases where these drugs have potent immunomodulatory properties and they help balance the immune system so that it becomes less hyperactive. And this can benefit people who suffer from autoimmune flares or allergies, things of that nature. So I'm personally a big fan of the drugs. I think they're great. I think that they open the door for a lot of people to achieve something that they would have never been able to achieve by themselves simply because they didn't have the motivation to. And I say that with all respect. Again, a lot the reason why 35% of the population is obese is because 99.99% of them don't actually care. And it's not a priority for them to lose the weight because either they just don't want to, or they have other aspects of their life that are just a higher priority, and once you become obese, biology really does fight back against you as you try to lose weight. If you start dieting, you'll become hungrier than if you were to be a normal weight and then diet a little bit. You're much more sensitive to those signals because you're trying to repair a system that's fundamentally dysregulated. And so these drugs kind of just, hit the nail on the head to get people to start moving in a direction that they wouldn't otherwise move in, with essentially very little effort on their part, which is why they're so popular. And again, I think this is great for some people who, with less food noise, all of that happening, it makes it easier to change their habits and implement the behavioral components that they need to sustain things without the drug. And for everyone else, if they want to be on the drug for the rest of their life because they don't want to make those behavioral changes, then that's their choice to make. But I think getting rid of obesity at a societal level is profoundly beneficial.
Well, absolutely. I truly believe that GLP-1s can single-handedly nullify obesity epidemic globally. And for a moment, I thought maybe I should not leave this in a full podcast episode. Maybe I'm just, overreacting or dramatizing. So it's really nice to hear you say, or at least you hope for the same outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I will say, essentially like curing obesity or reversing it is going to have a lot of benefits for the individual for their long-term
Hmm.
health. But, I will add that it's very short-sighted to kind of stop there. And what I mean by that is if somebody can't or won't engage in the behavioral changes necessary to facilitate a healthy body composition, then they're not going to do the things that would, that are required to improve the resilience of their body in other areas. So they're probably not going to exercise consistently. They're not going to do resistance training. They're not going to go out of their way to expose their body to types of controlled stressors that ultimately tell it to grow bigger and stronger, whether that's, intellectual stressors, physical, thermoregulatory, whatever. And so getting rid of obesity is a huge step in the right direction, but I'm not convinced that these drugs will actually help people live healthier lives in the long run because their body's still going to break down. Maybe just not as rapidly, but it's still going to break down if they aren't interested in the lifestyle changes that need to happen to maintain robust health as you grow older.
Can you give people some advice on how to prevent bad health outcomes?
Well, I mean, so from a dietary standpoint, I guess, the recipe for long-term success centers around eating sufficient protein, eating sufficient EPA and DHA, eating sufficient
Mm.
fiber, and making sure you're not deficient in any essential vitamin or mineral. Now, how you go about achieving all of that, there's a lot of ways to put it together. With somebody taking, Ozempic or whatever, it could be as simple as just having them take a multivitamin to make sure that they're still getting the vitamins and minerals that they might not be obtaining in food. I don't think this is really a long term strategy, but it's certainly a safety net during the dieting period. And my hope would be, that they can go back to eating more food to maintain their weight loss and have the focus be on nutrient dense options. Uh, but if not, then, a multivitamins a really easy safety net for anyone to do. Eating adequate protein to me means, consuming above 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. I think it's easier for most people to just aim for 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is 2.2 grams per kilogram, just because that's an easy number to remember. There's no real adverse effects that would come from this, and it's more likely than not to help someone. uh, Based on all of the data we have for weight loss, for muscle gain, for athletic performance. It's like, that upper end is going to help more people than the lower end would.
Mm.
Eating adequate fiber is important. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree on this, especially the carnivore people. But I mean, our microbiome is implicated in basically every health process occurring within the body. And that microbiome, we have a plethora of data showing that when you deprive it of dietary fibers, it becomes dysregulated. A lot of the bacteria who are feeding on those, fiber components will now switch to eating the mucin, the mucous membrane that your gut naturally produces.
Oh, wow.
Some of the bacteria eating it is totally normal and they're healthy bacteria because it helps keep that barrier in turnover, which is great. But when you remove all the fiber, the ones who prefer the fiber then start eating it too. And over time, that breakdown exceeds your body's capacity to replace it. And so
Mm.
now you don't have a mucus barrier. Now these bacteria are closer to the luminal wall. And now you're getting greater absorption of bacterial metabolites in the circulation. So you have more local and systemic inflammation. And your bacteria ultimately becomes dysbiotic. So, and The fiber discussion's a hard one because fiber is not one category. It would be like me saying eat adequate fat, right? It's like, okay, what does that mean? Like, because there's so many different types of fats and fatty acids. So with something like fiber, it takes, it would take a whole book to go through all of the different aspects of fiber. But the easiest thing I could say would be eating adequate fruits and vegetables will get you a diversity of different fibers that your body evolved consuming and that are beneficial to the gut. And we have literal interventions in humans where they increase fiber through fruits and vegetables, and the changes in the microbiome are beneficial. There's one study too that comes to mind where they increased, I think, fiber intake by 30 grams per day in a group of people. And what they found is that for like the first couple weeks, I believe it was, they reported, experiencing a little more bloating and gas, which is what you'd expect. But by the end of the intervention, their gastrointestinal symptoms were actually improved compared to before the intervention started. And so the authors logically they speculated that there's an adaptation period where you introduce more fiber and your microbiome needs time to adapt, but ultimately in the long run it benefits your gut health and makes you feel better and you don't experience those symptoms anymore. The problem is that most people experience those symptoms, maybe for like a week, and then they're like, yeah, this isn't working for me. And then they abandon it. And it's like, no, you need more time. You need more time to adapt. That's like me going to the gym for a week and being like, I haven't gained any muscle. This is pointless. Like, no, you need to be consistent with it. You need more time. And then omega-3s, in my writing of the omegas, interestingly enough, I've never actually seen good data that suggests that a high level of omega-6 intake is harmful to humans. But I've seen a lot of data suggesting that it's not the high omega-6 that's the problem, it's the low omega-3. And specifically the long-chained omega-3s, EPA and DHA. And when you give people like fish oil, for example, and you add it into their diet, it improves DHA incorporation into cell membranes. It associates with improved health outcomes. And it essentially, like if you're looking at the omega ratio, lowering omega-6 doesn't have the same effects as just increasing omega-3. And so I don't even really think the omega-6s are relevant. And if you look at some of the early research by Boyd Eaton on Paleolithic diets, he estimated that our ancestors were actually consuming, depending on where they lived, anywhere between 5 and 25 grams of omega-6 every day, which, I mean, the average intake in the US is 14 grams. So some populations were consuming a lot, but they were consuming equal amounts of omega-3s, especially long-chained omega-3s. So I think our physiology is totally accustomed to having relatively high intakes of the omega fatty acids, but what it's really looking for is having adequate amounts of the long-chained omega-3 fatty acids. Okay, I think that was all I said for the long term. I think those are the big levers from a dietary standpoint for good long-term health. I know that was kind of ranty.
No, man, that was awesome. That was awesome. So we have omega-3s, we have adequate protein intake, and we have adequate fiber intake. So when it comes to fiber, you just mentioned that there is an adaptation phase, right? Is there any higher threshold of fiber that people should maybe steer clear from? Is there such a thing as too much fiber, what I'm trying to say?
I think there's a heavy individual component, and that component involves not just, any number of the things for you personally. Like, for example, if you have IBS or IBD, your ability to tolerate fiber might be far less than somebody who doesn't have those gastrointestinal conditions. And so everyone kind of is just going to be at a different place in terms of how much fiber they can tolerate. But then at the same time, it's, well, where are they getting their fiber and what types of fiber are they not tolerating? Because getting somebody, for example, who has inflammatory bowel disease, if they're eating a lot of like cereal grains and getting a lot of insoluble fiber that creates bulk in their intestinal tract, that could very easily aggravate the inflammation they're experiencing in their bowels. But if you were to supplement something like gum acacia or partially hydrolyzed guar gum or any number of other prebiotic fibers, lactulose, these don't absorb water, they don't create bulk, they just travel to your large intestine where they are fermented by beneficial bacteria exclusively, which is why they're called prebiotic.
Mm-hmm.
And in clinical trials, giving these types of fibers to people with inflammatory bowel diseases improves their symptoms and improves outcomes, because dysbiosis is a common component of these gastrointestinal diseases. And so when you start addressing that dysbiosis through dietary intervention, it creates a cycle where more beneficial bacteria, things start to improve. That has direct feedback to the intestinal cells and it helps them get better, So I think we need to be very specific about the types of fiber we're talking about and the foods that we're eating. It's very reasonable to think that some people aren't going to be able to tolerate much, if any, fiber, from certain foods, but they could simultaneously benefit from using specific fiber supplements to help improve their gastrointestinal health. From like just a generic research standpoint, virtually all the research we have on fiber and like big health outcomes like mortality and cardiovascular disease and dementia, it's all linear. So there isn't a point where the benefit plateaus. It's literally the more and more you eat, the lower your risk of those things happening. We haven't really discovered that plateau.
Wow.
And then, certain indigenous hunter-gatherer tribes like the Hadza eat 100 to 140 grams of fiber every day. And they obviously aren't bloated. They don't have a lot of gut diseases because, when you start eating that amount of fiber from the time you're very young, you adapt and that just becomes kind of the norm. So yeah. So I think that the more fiber you can eat, the better, but where your threshold is going to vary depending on who you are as a person. And then, once you find that threshold or whatever, then there's ways to kind of work with it through targeted supplementation to improve your tolerance and help, like another example, let's just say you're eating a carnivore diet because it's controlling your autoimmune condition. You're not going to get any fiber on that diet because you don't eat plants. It doesn't matter how much fiber you can tolerate, you're not eating any, but we can still therapeutically help offset the harms to your gut microbiome by supplementing prebiotic fibers.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's no different than somebody eating a vegan diet taking a B12 pill. It's like, look, I'm eating this way for a certain reason, but it's not going to give me everything I need. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we live in the 21st century and I'm going to take a supplement.
And I see a lot of this where people who are on carnivore diet, who give fiber a shot or who give fruit and vegetables a shot, like you said, they try it for a week. It kind of feels like it's wrecking their gut and they extrapolate misinformation about the actual effectiveness of fiber. But it's really interesting to say that there's this relation between intake of fiber, positive relation between intake of fiber and health benefits. It's just amazing. When it comes to omega-3s, just want to ask you, is it true that different dosages of omega-3s play different roles in our bodies or have different purposes? I've seen a lot of people talking about if you take, for example, 2 grams of EPA and DHA combined, you're going to get these certain benefits on your cognitive health. If you take 6 grams, you're going to get certain other benefits for general health, for cardiovascular function and stuff like that. Is that true at all, or is it a myth?
Yeah, so yeah, there is some truth to it because when you take really high doses, you do start to experience more like drug-like effects, basically. So
Okay.
as an example, any amount of DHA that you take, EPA and DHA, let's just say fish oil, any amount of fish oil you take is going to increase the incorporation of those fatty acids into your cell membranes, which is beneficial. And it's going to increase with higher and higher doses. Maybe there's a point where it saturates. I don't know. But it's going to increase where the more you take, the bigger the increase in the incorporation into your phospholipids. Now you're just generally you're going to have different long-term health outcome effects based on this because like if you look at something like the omega-3 index, which measures the amount of DHA in your phospholipids as a percentage of the total fatty acids, if for example if you're below 4%, then your risk of all sorts of things, mortality, cardiovascular disease, dementia, whatever, is increased compared to if your level was over 8%. And so in a way, you're getting these long-term health benefits only with higher doses that would be sufficient to get your omega-3 index over an 8% threshold. And at the same time, that's going to apply to like inflammation because they're fundamentally anti-inflammatory. And so the more you have in your cell membranes, the more readily your body's going to be able to engage in resolving activities that help dampen inflammation. And if you take really high doses, above like 2 to 4 grams, those are the doses required to lower your triglyceride levels and thin your blood. And so those are actually, you can get those as a literal prescription for that purpose. And that's an effect that is specific to using higher doses. So yeah, the things do change with how much you take.
There's a plethora of benefits of omega-3s. My biggest concern, maybe question for you, you don't have to promote any particular brands, but are there any telltale signs that people are getting maybe underdosed supplements when it comes, in particular, omega-3s?
Brands are different in a lot of things, and the manufacturing of like the fish oil supplement is going to be very important for understanding how free of impurities it is and like maybe how oxidized or rancid it is before you take it, which is something you definitely don't want. There's been a ton of reports out there that like will buy them off the shelves and test them and see like, what is the quality of the supplement. And so I don't know any of that off the top of my head, but I would encourage people to go Google it and like look that stuff up. I don't think price is an important factor here. Like I personally like the life extension fish oil because they have a very lengthy process of distilling out the fish oil and making sure it stays good during that whole process. But it's actually not that expensive. It's like you can get a 1 to 2 month supply for $20 on Amazon. I think Nordic Naturals is another brand that is reliable. I definitely wouldn't buy like Costco brand or any, generic retailer brand. Like those are almost guaranteed to be absolute shit.
So when you say absolute shit, can you explain what particular context you mean? They are
like they're going to be
underdosed?
oxidized and rancid.
Okay.
And it's not going to provide you with those.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I mean, my thing with this is I would just encourage people to kind of, as much as I hate saying it, do your own research and understand that like when it comes to fish oil, that's not something that you want to skimp on in terms of quality. It's not like creatine where it's literally just creatine. Like it's impossible to screw that up, right? With fish oil, you can get it screwed up. So you want to make sure that you're working with a reliable manufacturing company.
Speaking of protein, probably just quickly because we already touched upon it. If I'm not mistaken, like Jose Antonio's lab, they experimented up to like 4 grams per, was it per kilogram?
4.4
of body weight?
Yeah.
Yeah, 4.4. So they haven't seen any detrimental effects on health, right? One thing that I will say just purely anecdotally, rapidly increasing or suddenly increasing protein intake significantly can wreck someone's gut, and I've seen this with clients as well. So I believe what we spoke about fiber, I think also when it comes to protein intake, maybe gradually and slowly increase it rather than all of a sudden adding up to 100 grams of additional protein. However, apart from people who have diagnosed kidney issues, so there are no potential threats to dangers that people might get, because a lot of people are afraid of consuming a lot of protein.
I mean, there's theoretical benefits, but some of them, or I mean, sorry, theoretical harms, and some of them might take decades to manifest. If you're talking about like kidney function, then there's no signal that high protein is going to harm your kidneys in the long term. If you're talking about gut health, that, well, we know that amino acids that are metabolized by the gut microbiome create a variety of harmful carcinogenic and genotoxic metabolites as a result of that. And, these effects are largely offset by consuming adequate fiber, because your gut's resilient, your microbiome's resilient. And if these things are being produced just naturally as part of the normal cycle going on down there, you're capable of dealing with them without any issues. But, a lot of people will, again, go high protein diet and then cut carbs down, which inevitably cuts down fiber. And, it's not surprising that they start experiencing some GI distress as a result of that, just because of the metabolites that the amino acids are making. Because contrary to popular belief, when you eat protein, it is not completely digested and absorbed in the small intestine. Even something like meat, like if you're eating beef, the digestibility is only 92 to 94%, which means that all that protein that you're eating, 5% of it basically is going to escape your digestion and make it to your large intestine. And so if you eat more and more meat, then that means that 5% grows and you get more and more amino acids down there. So I don't think it's like an intrinsically a bad thing. And I think there's a lot of benefits for high protein diets, but you do also need to be mindful about taking care of your gut simultaneously. Another theoretical concern that I haven't seen really anyone talk about relates to calcium balance in the bones. So all of the data we have overall, this is called the acid ash hypothesis, by the way. And it basically says when you eat protein, it's acidic, and then you have to break down your bone to release bicarbonates and calcium and magnesium to help buffer the acids that are being produced by the amino acids, especially the sulfuric amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't any good data to support that. Because protein has direct anabolic effects on bone tissue, and protein increases calcium absorption from the intestinal tract. So studies that measure total calcium balance in the body, even though eating high protein leads to greater urinary calcium losses, when you measure total body balance, it stays the same because you're absorbing more calcium from the diet. And over the long term, we see that people have stronger bones. They're at a lower risk of fractures because protein acts like directly on bone tissue to increase laying down more minerals. So it is beneficial for the bones. The theoretical concern here is if you're consuming a very high protein diet without sufficient alkalinity and without sufficient calcium. So protein increases calcium absorption for the gut, but if you're not consuming a good amount of calcium, there's nothing for you to absorb more of. And so over
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
that could lead to losses in bone tissue over decades, right? And simultaneously, we have studies. There was one study done in the 90s that looked at 25 different diets that had all the variables manipulated. And what they found is that 70% of the acid load in the body is explained by the ratio of potassium to protein. And so if you're eating a very high protein diet without adequate amounts of potassium, the number one source of potassium being plants, then your body is going to be more acidic. And, you know, that's just not good. Like we know that. And the reason it's not good, I guess I need to explain this too. I'm not saying your blood pH changes. Like your
Hmm.
blood pH can't change or else you're going to die. But when we say you're more acidic, what that means is that your buffering capacity in your body is more stressed. So if you have more acids in the blood, your blood can't change its acidity or you'll die. And so your body needs to do all these things to get it back into where it needs to be. And the primary way it does that is breaking down bone tissue to release minerals and bicarbonate. And so over time, just theoretically, a high protein diet that's very low in potassium and low in calcium could lead to long-term bone issues. Just because you're not taking in the things that help offset that theoretical concern. Now, this is just all hypothetical based on mechanisms. Like I said earlier, there is no data currently that a high protein diet harms bone tissue. And in fact, quite the opposite, it seems to benefit it. But all of that was within the context of a normal potassium intake and adequate calcium. And so if, for whatever, Vladimir Stefanin from the Bellevue Hospital experiment, he was that guy who got followed for a year eating an all meat diet to see how it worked.
Yeah. Yeah.
Over the course of that year, he had a net loss of like 10,000 milligrams of calcium. And that's not enough to meaningfully affect bone health, but it was a huge net negative calcium balance over the course of that year because by eating an all meat diet, he wasn't getting much potassium or calcium. And so he had a huge net loss. And so hypothetically, you extend that out decades, and it's reasonable to think that someone could lose bone tissue.
Interesting. And I'm glad you brought that up. I remember reading on it, and I can't remember who. I think it was maybe Martin McDonald who mentioned that particular case study as well. You touched upon creatine, and just quickly, you mentioned you literally cannot fuck up creatine. It's just like you have monohydrate, especially when we're talking about creatine use for recreational lifters, for general population. In most cases, we're talking specifically about monohydrate. For me, and what I recommend to my clients, the safest bet is creatine monohydrate with a CreaPure patent on it. I think that's so. Similar question to you when it comes to omega-3s. Recommended dosages was always 3 to 5 grams on a daily basis. Loading period not necessary, right? However, if there's a loading period, I think the dosages that were recommended were up to 20 grams. And now I see a lot of people, a lot of prominent figures in our industry, in fitness and health industry, recommending daily dosages, so 20 plus grams. Because in layman's terms, after 5 to 10 grams that we benefit for production of ATP energy and for muscle glycogen storage, after that, everything else kind of just spills over into cognitive benefits and brain health.
Well, I don't think that muscle is first priority for creatine. So when you're taking, for example, 5 grams every day, after a month, you've saturated phosphocreatine stores in your muscle tissue. But that doesn't mean that you're not getting benefits to other body systems. You're still going to also be increasing creatine stores in your neurons. You're going to be S-adenosylmethionine in the liver, because 40% of all of that specific methyl donor, which is the primary methyl donor of the entire body, 40% of it in the liver is used for synthesizing creatine. And when you supplement it, your body says, we don't need to make it anymore. And so now suddenly you have 40% more SAMe to go around and methylate other things that need methylation. There's very preliminary research that suggests that higher doses of creatine, like 20 grams a day, could benefit brain health more than lower doses. There's nothing really there for me to say with any sort of confidence, but neurons do take more, like higher concentrations to fully saturate than muscle tissue does. So, I mean, it would make sense if you needed, maybe 10 or 15 grams, maybe more, I don't know, to saturate like brain stores of creatine compared to the lower amounts needed for just muscle. If someone wants to play around with it, I don't see there being a problem because creatine is not harmful. It's one of the few supplements that's been studied in what seems like virtually every possible condition out there, even, kidney failure with some degree of benefit. And so I really don't think taking high doses of creatine is going to be harmful for anyone. And I think that pretty much everyone should be taking 5 grams per day, a teaspoon of creatine or whatever every day. And if people want to play around with going higher, by all means, try it. It's a cheap supplement. If it works for you, maybe you'll notice something. Maybe you'll notice an improved brain function. And if you do, great. And if you don't, no harm done.
So this is just me, and this is like not n equals 1. Alex, for me personally, I've been doing that for the past, I want to say like a year. I haven't really noticed anything. And I'm kind of wondering, how the hell can I notice it? What do I need to observe? Because I think that's also a problem with a lot of supplements that we want to experiment on ourselves, especially in the context of reducing or increasing dosages, is like, what the hell are we even looking for?
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of things that benefit health that you can't feel. And I think it's wonderful when people pay attention to their body and, they can feel things or whatever. But there's a lot of stuff that is going to provide you with benefits without you necessarily being consciously aware of it.
Gotcha.
And, that is the case for creatine. Most of the time, like freeing up methyl donors, you're not going to feel that. Some people might. Some people actually might get higher levels of anxiety from it because they now have too many methyl donors and they need something like glycine to help buffer that.
Okay, I did not know that.
But most people, it's just not going to be noticeable. And you can say that about most diet and supplement interventions. So yeah, paying attention to how you feel is great, but there needs to be an element of understanding that you're not going to subjectively be able to pick up on everything that's going on, good or bad. And so that's why it's important to have clinical research that can help guide us, like how likely is it for a certain thing to happen.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Awesome. Thank you. Alex, man, thank you so much for this. Thank you for taking so much time. For people who are watching this or listening to this, we had one absolutely failed catastrophic attempt of recording a podcast, and Alex was so absolutely graceful and just man, thank you for doing this with me. And I'm just going to ask you, where can people find you? And
people can find me on social media. Alex Leaf on Facebook, Alex Leaf on X. I'm also on Instagram, and they can go to alexleaf.com to see my website. There isn't much on there, but you can find a list of like podcasts that I've been on, for example. So
yeah, you are almost like an anomaly in our industry, meaning you don't have this loud, dramatic social media presence. You don't offer services. You are not a coach who works directly with people. You're always under the radar, but whenever you have to say something, people just listen. And so I'm really honored to have you here and to have this chat with me. So thank you very much once again, man.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words and for having me.